In this video, I'm going to explore some of the science behind equine behaviour and training around the use of bitless and bitted bridles. It's a huge subject area and I've done my best to make this video as comprehensive as possible. But before I get started, there are two indisputed facts. Number one, the horse's mouth has never evolved to accommodate a bit, and there's no convenient space in the horse's mouth just waiting to be filled by one. Number two, there's no bit on the market or lack of bit that will ever overcome training or performance issues. The horse's ability to perform a behaviour is reflected of training and not the presence of a special bit or a bitless bridle. With that all said, let's go pull out some science. Learning theory is the term used to describe how animals learn, including horses. And for the purpose of this video, I'll primarily be talking about negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is best explained by the removal of pressure or an adversive stimulus. It's this removal of pressure that reinforces a particular behaviour. And regardless if we're training our horses with the use of the bit or bitless, we're using negative reinforcement to train the slow, the stop and turn responses. When bit pressure or noseband pressure is applied to ask for the stop, it's the release of the pressure that teaches the horse through negative reinforcement that yes, stop, that's what was required. And regardless of whether it's a bit or bitless training, it's the correct release of this negative reinforcement that is the key component. Throughout equitation history, bits have been the primary means of controlling the horse. But there is a growing question among the public, horse owners and professionals about the use of bitless. And we can see that the training principles are the same using negative reinforcement. However, one question that's often asked is bitless safe? Safety is paramount in the equine industry. I say this a lot, but they're half a ton of a flight animal, and the ability to ensure we can ride them safely and work around them with some degree of control is very important for both the human and horse safety. This mostly boils down to, am I able to stop my horse when required? It might be oversimplifying horse training, but stopping or having brakes is kind of a key safety feature. So will my horse stop with a bitless bridle? If we apply the same training principles, i.e. negative reinforcement and the release of pressure, we can train the horse to slow and stop using noseband pressure, just like we would with a bit. In fact, there's been a lot of success in training bitless riding, and in some cultures, hackamores and bostels are actually the preferred means of controlling the horse. In some of these cases, training with traditional bits have really proven ineffective. We can also see the results in experimental settings. The graph I'm showing you here is the number of steps horses took after the rein aid to stop was applied. Half the horses were trained using a bitless bridle and the other half were bitted. The horses in this experiment were in their foundation training, and prior to undertaking any ridden work, they were first long-reined. During long reining, bitless horses stopped sooner compared to those who were bitted. This experiment indicated that horses in the bitless bridle were more likely than those in the bitted bridle to be able to perform the correct response, which was stop, when the halt stimulus was applied. It basically means that using a bitless bridle actually helped or was more effective in teaching these foundation horses what the stimulus response relationship for halt was, i.e. pressure means stop. What's really interesting here is that when horses moved onto their ridden work, there was no real difference in the stopping power of the rein aids between our bitless horses and our bitted. The proponents of bitless often advocate that bits cause horses pain. There is evidence to show that bits are a potential source of enormous discomfort to the horse. And it seems intuitive, as the mouth is a highly sensitive area, it would seem quite reasonable to suggest that excessive pressure on a highly sensitive area would cause pain. Despite this, bits are universally used and accepted within equitation, even though there are now a substantial number of problems, both behavioural and physiological, that are associated with bits. These problems can range from mild to acute conflict behaviours, such as bucking, rearing and bolting, as well as training concerns such as lack of flexibility, energy, forward motion, or leaning on or above the bit. There's also some growing scientific evidence for the term known as bit lameness or bridle lameness. However, the science here is quite young. We need more data and research for me to be able to speak to it properly. So hopefully we'll see more science in this area in the coming years, and maybe in a few years I can circle back and we can talk about it. Either way, proponents of bitless riding often state that bitless is pain-free. Many of the bitless bridles are marketed and sold to riders as a pain-free alternative. This is quite appealing as we don't want to intentionally hurt our horses. I'd like to quote a statement for you from one proponent of a named bitless bridle. Bridle X employs pressure over a larger surface area compared to a traditional bitted bridle and gently pushes the horse in the desired direction. A bitted bridle, on the other hand, focuses greater pressure on a smaller, highly sensitive region of the horse's mouth. Now this is a little bit, no pun intended, disingenuous to suggest it gently pushes anything. As I've already discussed, bitless bridles use pressure from the rein aid. The response from the horse is based on pressure mainly across the nasal plane to train the desired response. It's often thought that since these bridles do not have a bit in their design, that they're not capable of inflicting pain on the horse, hence the gentle pushing statement. But they still hold the potential to cause injury, especially if used by a rider with unyielding hands. Moreover, when we combine this noseband pressure with a leverage, such as those offered by devices with long curb shanks, the pressure that's applied by the rider, which is already concentrated on a relatively small area of the horse's nose and poll, can be intensified greatly. In addition to that, the material used to construct the noseband component can take very little physical effort on the part of the rider to injure the horse's nose or jaw. Okay, Barbara, I appreciate that in that section I said bits cause problems and discomfort, and so can bitless. I'm not planning on ending the endless debate between the proponents of bits and bitless with this short video, but I can try and provide some science here. And lucky for us, some researchers have done all the legwork to help shed some light. We can measure pain and stress in horses using heart rate and heart rate variability, which is changes from one heart rate to another. Pain and stress have long been associated with an increase in heart rate and can easily be measured to help us indicate if the horse is in stress or pain. This graph here shows the heart rate of horses during foundation training. During their first bridling experience, these horses showed no difference in heart rate between a bitless bridle and a bitted. Bear in mind these were naive horses. In other words, they'd never been exposed to a bridle before, only head collars up to this point. It's been suggested that just having a bit in a horse's mouth, a highly sensitive area, will cause pain to the horse, regardless if the handler is doing anything, i.e. not using any rein pressure. However, we can see from this graph that it doesn't appear to be the case. This data suggests that the bit alone in the horse's mouth doesn't actually cause any pain or stress by it just laying dormant. However, bits don't just sit in the horse's mouth as fancy jewellery. They are used along with pressure from the reins to elicit a behavioural response. For instance, mouth pain is associated with heavy-handed riding or indeed inappropriate gear. Some jointed bits can cause pinching between the second premolars and labia, which does indeed cause the horse pain. When the same researchers first introduced the horses to rein pressure, these bitted horses had a much higher heart rate during the long rein, which was their first exposure compared to the ridden work. That suggested that these bitted horses were experiencing more pain and or a higher stress level at the start of their foundation training, compared to those trained using bitless. If we compare the steps taken and the heart rate together, this might suggest that when we first expose our horses to rein pressure, wearing a bitless bridle may be more beneficial in reducing pain and stress, and they'll learn faster, especially when we first introduce our horse to a halt stimulus, i.e. the rein pressure to stop. Heart rate is all well and good to measure pain and stress, if you have that piece of kit just kicking about. But there are other markers that we can use to measure pain or stress in horses. These are a set of behaviours a horse can display called conflict behaviours, or behaviours from a pain ethogram. Now there's a huge body of work done on this area, and unfortunately I don't have the time to cover all in this video. I already foresee this being quite a long video. However, if you would like to see another video which does discuss this research, primarily speaking about facial pain ethogram and the ridden pain ethogram in horses, please do comment below. Alternatively, I will link in the description to the primary literature if you wish to learn more. along with all the other papers that I covered in this video. Because, as I said, this research is really extensive, I'm only going to touch on 2 behaviours that are very common in the ridden horse. These are head shaking and tail swishing. Head shaking, also referred to as head reefing or head tossing, are generally associated with running away behaviours. Head tossing is a conflict behaviour that could also be associated with mouth pain. The horse might be triggered to seek relief from the bit pressure and pull the reins out of the rider's hands. Research has shown that horses initially bitted will display more head shaking behaviours compared to those that are bitless. Science does support the proposal that the horse is attempting to run away from the bit pressure. However, it's also the case that these behaviours do decrease over time. Now the question is, why do they decrease over time? We don't really know. Is it due to learned helplessness? This is when the horse stops performing a behaviour because it's effectively futile. Or is it habituation? The horse becomes accustomed to the bit pressure and the associated training. Just to make it even more confusing, head tossing can also be associated with problems in acceleration. Head tossing might be due to confusion during an upward gait movement or an intergait transition, such as a faster walk, trot, or canter. It could well be that head tossing is performed due to poor timing by the rider or poor release of an acceleration cue and not connected with the bit at all. The second behaviour I want to discuss is tail swishing during ridden work. Tail swishing is associated with discomfort in the horse, usually in relation to leg, spur, or whip use. It can also be due to dysfunction in acceleration or a loss of self-carriage. In other words, it is considered a conflict behaviour as there's some conflict in the horse and it manifests as a tail swish. As with the head toss, research has shown that bitted horses exhibit more tail swishing compared to bitless. Generally, the tail swish is associated with poor acceleration responses. The cause is usually inconsistent negative reinforcement on the part of the rider. For instance, asking for a stop with the reins at the same time as we're asking for a go with the leg pressure can create confusion as to which is the correct signal. Is it acceleration or deceleration? Here, Blossom is performing said behaviour. I'm afraid I don't have one for head tossing. I'm asking her to slow the canter down, which is an intergait transition. This tail swish is a result of me asking for the canter, pressure from my legs, but also using my reins to try and slow the canter down. It's ultimately a conflicting signal, my own inconsistency with my reinforcement, which leads to the tail swish. Don't worry, that isn't my only Blossom tail swish example. Here's the tail swish again, and its cause is the same, me. I ask her to slow down to make this turn for the jump, but I'm still asking her to sustain the canter and slow it down at the same time. It could well be that bit pressure is the source of these conflict behaviours and pain in the horse. Watching our horse's behaviour is an invaluable tool and is learning for all of us as riders. It can help us potentially find a source of stress or pain or conflict in our horses. But there are a number of factors we need to look at, including ourselves. Not just one behaviour in isolation and assume the bit is the root cause. Finally, I want to speak about bits and bitless in performance horses. In other words, using horses for competitions. I think it's worth taking the time to ask what are the consequences of bits and bitless in competitions. In competition settings, chewing the bit and opening the mouth is not considered desirable. When horses in foundation training were introduced to the bit, they chewed and opened their mouths more compared to bitless horses. It's not surprising really, and most likely due to the fact that there is a foreign object now in their mouths. However, just to confuse things a little, chewing has been regarded as an indicator of the horse being relaxed. But if you're in a competition setting, you're penalised for it. From this research then, bitless may be an option if you don't want your horse to chew or open its mouth and therefore incur penalties. However, for the majority of competitions, bitless is prohibited. And there's the rub. If you want chewing and you regard it as an indicator of your horse being relaxed in a competition setting, you'll be penalised. If you don't want to incur penalties and ride bitless, you can't. This rule is best demonstrated in dressage. The rules dictate that a horse will only open his mouth if you're not using light pressure. But this is fundamentally not true. Horses open their mouths for lots of different reasons, and it doesn't necessarily mean that light pressure wasn't applied. For example, here is Blossom stretching and opening her mouth, and I'm not even touching the reins. Unfortunately, this has led to a trend in over-tight or restrictive nosebands and noseband pressure. When horses open their mouths to evade the bit, one approach riders have taken is to use a noseband to keep the mouth tightly closed. Research has demonstrated that this practice has shown not to elicit a relaxation of the jaw, but to act as an additional stressor for the horse. 30 years ago, nosebands were largely aesthetic rather than functional. But these days, restrictive nosebands on horses are being tightened so much in some equestrian competitions that horses suffer from stress, reduced blood flow in that area, and ultimately it leads to deformities in the nasal bones. Out of 750 horses studied in competition settings, where researchers measured noseband tightness using the classic two-finger rule, only 7% of the horses passed. Just to highlight the detrimental effects of over-tight nosebands, a tightened noseband has been likened to the pressure from a tourniquet, which in humans has shown can cause tissue and nerve damage. Here are two photos of Blossom 12 months apart. You can see the deformities in her nasal bones from when I first bought her, particularly if you compare this to 12 months on. This damage to the nasal plane occurred due to an over-tight noseband and an application of a flash that was applied to her for years. Until I bought her, and then I set all my nosebands on fire. No, not really. I ride with no noseband when using a bit, and as such these nasal bones on Blossom had time to heal over 12 months. Sadly, the practice of restricting jaw movements has become entrenched in the equine industry. Primarily seen in dressage, a horse opening his mouth is regarded as a sign of resistance or lack of compliance, and as such attracts penalties for the rider. But over-tight nosebands have bled into other disciplines. But what's actually happening is as the noseband tightness increases, there's also an elevation in the horse's sensitivity to the bit, and as such the bit becomes more uncomfortable. An over-tight noseband with a bit forces the cheeks against sharp molars and are often associated with lacerations and ulcers in the horse's mouth. By their design, over-tight nosebands restrict normal jaw and tongue movements in the horse, compromising several behaviours in the horse such as yawning, licking, chewing and swallowing. Unsurprisingly, denying horses oral comfort is associated with psychological distress. By over-tightening a noseband, you can mask unwanted behaviour, which could indicate pain or deficiencies in training, or both. I would like to see a shift in judging of competitions, not to penalise the horse for chewing, not to allow the use of over-tight nosebands, and to allow competitors to ride bitless if they so desire. Then horse riders can make their own assessments of their own horses, whether to ride bitless or bitted. Because at the moment, there isn't much choice if you wish to compete. Horses can then express their normal oral behaviours and don't suffer undue pressure from a noseband. That just about sums it up, except, well, all of that is research conducted in experimental settings and is effectively controlled. And it's beneficial to have a look at others who've made the transition from bitted to bitless and see how they got on. In my last section, I'm primarily going to focus on one study where there were 66 horses identified as having some form of recognised behavioural pain or stereotypical behaviour. Out of these 66 horses that were bitted and moved to bitless, there was a marked 87% decrease in the performance of these recognised pain behaviours or stereotypical behaviours. Only one horse in the study showed no reduction in pain signals when bit free, which likely suggests there was some other underlying issue. Now, before you go away thinking, yeah, sure, they were all happy hackers and cobs, nope. These horses included 21 thoroughbreds, 11 Arabs, 7 warm bloods, as well as just one stallion, like Honest Todd. The disciplines ranged from everything from dressage, pleasure and leisure riders, eventers and jumpers. Including this 87% decrease in the performance of these pain-related behaviours, none of the riders experienced a loss of control when bit free. In fact, some of the riders even stated a greater degree of control was possible. So from an everyday perspective, there may be some merit in trying bitless. For me personally, this is one of the reasons why I added bitless riding into my training repertoire. It was because I recognised my horse was presenting some conflict behaviour during jumping. To cut a long story short, I'm a very nervous jumper, and by that very fact I can inadvertently apply unrelenting bit pressure. It's not intentional, but I'm still causing confusion and possibly pain. When I removed the bit and started jumping bitless, the conflict behaviour all but disappeared and our jumping performance increased. This can both improve my performance, learning, and hopefully develop some of my confidence in my jumping, while trying to reduce any potential pain that I might be causing for Blossom. Personally, I'll continue to use both bits and bitless. I really don't live in any one camp, except for the no overtight nosebands please camp. I can't tell you what's right for you and your horse. You're your own expert on you. But hopefully this video provided some useful information. If trying bitless riding is something you were looking to try, and that's why you've come here, my biggest tip is to ensure that your horse has the basic responses to rein pressure first, in that they can slow, stop, back up to light pressure. And if you're interested in seeing more on that, I do have a video on training the hackamore for the first time, where I use both positive and negative reinforcement to make sure I have these responses. I just want to leave you on a quote from the study with the 66 riders who went bitless. After owning a horse for years, riders discovered that many unwanted behaviours they just assumed were immutable characteristic traits of their horse were corrected when they removed the bit. They were sometimes aware their horse was performing signs of pain when bitted, but it wasn't until they removed the bit did they recognise the source of that pain. Using different methods can help us learn, it can help us develop, and it can help us become better riders.